Oh yeah, here are our speakers as well. So just to put a face to the name. But to start off, we'll start off with Angelos, who will show you a little bit about why we are organizing this conference and all the details about that. So, Angelos.
Cool, yeah, thanks.
Here you go.
All right, yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Angelos, and I work at Elisa. And this year we're building this conference. As Eve has mentioned, the name is Joint Futures. And I'm very happy that all of you are here and you perhaps want to listen more, find out more about the conference, but also what the hell do we mean when we talk about holistic design. So this is the talk that I'm trying to give today towards holistic design approach, and kind of like, the main reasoning behind why we're building this conference. But to start off, I do have a catch box here, and I would like to ask you a very simple question. What is the value of design? Anyone can say something or want to say something. No? Wow. Yeah, so this is a big question. What is the value of design? For example, is it the UIs that we are building, like the outputs that we're creating? Is the value of design the user experience that those outputs are informing? Is it, for example, the designers themselves and the relationship that they have within the company, their processes? Or is it the culture that the designers are creating? And, is it maybe the sum of all those things together? I guess this question is very big, as we said, but it's something like to ponder on when we kind of like talk about this. However, to understand design holistically, we need to observe and operate in multiple levels that we identify as craft, operations, and strategy. And we'll get there later, but those are kind of like three different levels. As Eve has mentioned, it's kind of like the craft, which is the design doing, operations, which is enabling the design, and then there's the strategy, so directing design. Design is not just a function. When design is reduced to simply the outputs that we just said, like the deliverables, for example, as opposed to the processes that come along within, the operations that they're behind and all that, it is seen as merely as an execution. And it's hard to justify the value of design then, because while pushing pixels can contribute to the betterment of the products, still the real value of design is not shown directly through that. And in similar scenarios, when design happens in isolation, like for example just UX or just service design, it's very kind of like hard to understand the real value of design, because there are many things that go in the background that we just simply do not see. This was a very interesting quote from Andrea Mignolo, as he said that we contort ourselves into ROI shapes, thinking that we are being good business allies, but we forget that the value of design is not just the outcomes, but the process of designing itself. And in an attempt perhaps to kind of like to put a value that the designers, they're trying to map into their own kind of like processes and building outputs and outcomes, we try to do ROI calculations that, they fit into the revenue streams, and they fit into things that design might have impact on, like for example, a product that's getting launched. But what is the expected, for example, those are the questions. What is the expected revenue of the product after we kind of like design it and ship it, for example? What are the cost savings that we're going to have if we're going to, bring design up front? And we look for metrics that, they try to help us kind of like, bring those answers to the table and justify the ROI of design. But sometimes in the process, we kind of like, we see the tree, but we miss the whole forest. Also, design is not just a partner. In mature, customer-centric companies, design has evolved. Like, it helps in developing teams, for example. It helps with the UX being embedded inside those teams. Designers and developers can work and collaborate more efficiently, and designers can help with, for example, design research. But however, still design cannot have kind of like a real value if it's compartmentalized into silos, and kind of like, there's no real connection with the whole kind of like design organization in that company. And how then do you break all that? Well, turns out that it's really not easy. It's fairly complicated. And we'll try to go through this. So if you want holistic change throughout your organization to facilitate better design, then you need teamwork and collaboration. Fairly simple. But then that requires communication, like good communication, which then requires psychological safety and interpersonal trust. Psychological safety is kind of like a shared belief that kind of like we're not going to be in trouble if we're going to take risks in our daily work. And usually, actually, that's where the conversation stops. But then, however, psychological safety and interpersonal trust require active listening and empathy. And if you're lucky enough, that's the next stage that you go to in a more mature organization, but then also that's where it usually stops. However, active listening and empathy requires vulnerability and requires to be self-aware and to be able to self-reflect on what you're doing. And then that requires the whole kind of like adult developmental capability. So it's quite interesting that there are a lot of things that go in the background, and we often kind of like miss them because it can be through to velocity or kind of like all kinds of other different reasons. So there are 3 levels of design, as we mentioned before. There's a craft, operations, and strategy. So let's pick those 3, and let's put kind of like 3 different lenses to understand those levels of design. Craft is the design doing. We have as an example there the design systems. Everyone knows perhaps what those are. They're quite popular, quite hot topic. It is the ways of working, the tooling, the outcomes, and the outputs, and so on. As an example, design systems, they create certain key outcomes that help companies and teams. For example, speed to market, cost efficiency, cross-collaboration is getting increased because kind of like the work between designers and developers in design systems teams is getting more, muddied. Operations is the enabling of design. And as an example here, we have design operations and research operations. They have certain key outcomes that come into play when you incorporate those in your design organizations. For example, increasing design hours, measuring design efficiency, operationalizing the processes. One great example was from last year in Design Ops Summit in New York. Some person from Intuit was sharing that they managed to increase the design hours of designers from 15 hours to 20 hours per week, which was, it sounds very little, but then they have 500 designers. So if you multiply those 5 hours per designer gained to actually do design work and not do other things, like for example, be in the loop process of getting hiring someone and so on, then you can understand how much output and outcomes they created by just solving certain issues like that and helping someone to, or having someone to actually be there and taking care of the back work. So you're able to create better understanding for your employees in their needs of kind of like the new employees, onboarding, for example, team formation and efficiency, and many different things. And then we have strategy, which is basically the design directing. A strong leadership, for example, is having one eye on the horizon, but also one eye on the next step, what's happening in the near future. And design leadership is a big example here, which kind of like if you have a strong leadership, you have certain key outcomes, being able to understand, make the right thing, being able to deliver the right product and deliver the product right, be able to learn and discover as a team and have a vision. But of course, that's not all. Design leadership should be engaging to the community that is, of course, first maybe inside the company. Like, for example, if you are a design leader in Elisa, you might be able to engage with your vendors, the companies who are working with you, which is kind of like the immediate universe, so to speak. But then there's also the universe of the design community that is like you all here, that you specifically do not work with Elisa. There's advocacy, so promoting and selling the value of design. There's capabilities, team, collaboration, and all that stuff. So we come to a point that we try to understand design as a whole. And that's where the topic of kind of like emergence comes in. What emergence is that in philosophy and systems theory, and also science and art, emergence is a condition where an entity having properties that its parts do not have. For example, if you observe a flock of birds in the sky, and if you try to scrutinize, like, what is this bird doing or what is this bird doing, you cannot understand the fact that there is, for example, one or a few single birds who are orchestrating the whole movement of the flock. And same goes in nature, for example, with ants, that if you observe one ant, you can observe it your whole life, but you will never know that having kind of like a colony of ants can, for example, build a bridge to cross spaces that they simply cannot cross if they are by themselves. So holistic design is kind of like, the emergence there is to understand and solve problems in all those three levels that design operates, and see it kind of like in a more systemic type of approach. But is that all? Well, turns out that it gets even more complicated, because design in its entirety is a wicked challenge. Design is holistic, and if it's holistic, then it has to be accountable, it has to be strategic, inclusive and diverse, it has to create impact, it has to be integrated, it has to be intentional, and it has to be data informed. And I specifically use data informed, not data driven. So, holistic. As designers, we have the opportunity to use our tools and frameworks, coupled with our ability to catalyze change, in order to shape the conversation around how do we change our design organizations inside our companies for the benefit, of course, of the company, but also not just that. For design to be accountable, designers have to have the fundamental skills of asking why, but also saying no. How to use them and be gatekeepers in the, for the users. Design has to be strategic, as I mentioned, one eye on the horizon, but also one eye on the next wave. So it has to be aware of what's happening in the near future, maybe in the broad future as well, what are the risks, and also what's happening in the next couple of months. Design has to be inclusive and diverse, so broadening the perspectives and building empathy, building diversity into the teams and processes, building inclusion inside designs. How do you design for your users, but also how do you make sure that you do not exclude those who are not your immediate users as well? Design has to be impactful. How do we align profit that our companies are making with impact? How can we adopt a model that checks that, for example, we align with the UN's sustainability development goals? Design as well has to be integrated. So how do we make design an equal player of the famous Venn diagram, the trifecta of design, tech, and business? But also it has to be intentional. So it has to have a purpose, and purpose is the shape that meaning takes in business. There's a recent kind of studies that show that a lot of customers actually, that they can afford that, of course, they try to affect what kind of products that they're buying. And there was a study from Edelman that says that 72% of respondents said that they would recommend a company with a purpose, which is a 39% increase from 2008 when they asked them last. So that was like a few years ago. And in the Havas Meaningful Brands Index, they say that the purpose-led companies, for example, and teams, they perform way better than the others who didn't have that. And customers just didn't care if a brand was actually is going to be dead tomorrow. Like, they don't care about that. They care about what does it bring to you and what kind of value. And of course, last but not least, it has to be data informed. You have to use data, of course, but also you have to use your gut, and you have to use everything else. There's a lot of things that go around here in the everything else part. So the more we zoom out and we observe design as a part of a system, The more we realize and we understand that the wicked problems, they require extraordinary solutions in multidisciplinary and inclusive approaches. So how do we start? That's a good question. Well, we've been thinking about these things for the conference as well, and we would like to ask you to, join the conversation. The first step that we say from our part is to, join the Joint Futures conference and be part of this community, engage in the different channels and meetings that we're creating, such as this one, for example. Advocate and promote this new approach and build with us. This is not happening today, not happening perhaps in the conference, but it's happening in the future. So how do we build this new approach, and how do we create an open source, frameworks and tools? How do we establish policies and kind of like checks ourselves when we go into, ethical and inclusive building of kind of like different approaches? And how do we practice? How do we test those frameworks and then come back and say, these are the results and they help us? We try to see all these things through our, throughout the time that we are building this conference, and we try to build the lineup that is going to help us to understand certain things and then move on into the building. And we have a few people that are joining us on September 3rd and 4th, but also on the 5th that we have workshops. And many of you might know many of them. I'm not going to go through all the names. There are people who, they are designers. There are people who are innovators. There are people who are design innovators as well. And many of them, they contribute actively into the design community. And thank you, everyone, for listening to me as well.
All right, thank you, Angelos.